Hi readers, we've been thinking deeply about characters for this whole unit, and so far we've done lots of really important character work, like expecting characters to be complicated and showing more than one trait. We've read further and revised our thinking in the face of new evidence. We looked at likable and less likable sides. We have discovered that some traits matter more than the others because they affect the rest of the story, and we've thought about the pressures that our characters have. So now that we have thought about the character work during the beginning and the middle and the end of a story, we should be approaching the end of our first part of our books. And I thought we could spend some time thinking together about the sorts of things that we should do when we get to the end of the book. And some things that successful readers often do when they get to the end of their books. I will point out, I'd like to mention that whenever I was a sixth grader, you may hear your parents say things like, well, don't you do a book report? We had to do book reports or posters or write papers about our book or do projects about our book. We did a lot of projects. What we have learned in reading is that we like to make reflections at the end. So we're working, our last goal for this bend of this unit is to reflect on the characters and the story again after we have read all the way through the end of the book. When you read a book, it is very much similar to hiking up a mountain in a way. The end, when you get to the top of the mountain or the end of the book, it gives you perspective. It's valuable to linger there for just a bit. Take a look back on the trail you and the characters have traveled, seeing the whole of it. You might look back at the steps you took. Just sit and enjoy the end of your work getting there. You certainly wouldn't climb up a mountain and then say, okay, I'm here, time to go home right away. You'd probably really enjoy the view. You'd sit and think about all the tricky parts you had to climb. You would think about the streams and the nature you passed, and then you would also just enjoy getting to your goal. The time, you might think about the time you strained yourself to get past the next level. In the same way, when you look back over your novel or your book or your story from the perspective of the ending, new parts seem significant that maybe didn't stand out as much before. You might have new insight about the characters and the story that might have been confusing. During this part, you might be able to think things like, oh, wow, now I know why he or she did that, or now I knew I was right about him or her, or man, whenever I think back at that first chapter, that little teeny piece of that little detail was like a clue to what was going to happen at the end, and now I know that because I got to the end. Something I find myself doing at the end of the book after I finish is going back to earlier parts to check back on this scenario, or that conversation, so my brain can make all of the connections now that I know more since I read to the end. So I invite you to do the same. I'm going to give you some ideas of things that you can do whenever you get to the end, places that you can look to help you think about the end, think about your book with the perspective of the ending. Okay, so some different things that you could take a look at are the opening scene or the first parts of the book. Are there any details or clues that take on more meaning now? Critical moments of decision, do some end up affecting what happens in the end? Like if your character made this decision versus that decision, does that affect what happens in the end? Are there moments when minor characters become major players? Were some moments with minor characters keys to what happened? Any kind of confusing details or allusions? Were there references or details that didn't make sense that are now clear that you got to the end of the book? And are there any inspiring actions that the character took? Moments the character really inspired you? You can jot down some of the things that you learned from doing this in your annotations in your reader's notebook once you get to the end of your book, so that you can reflect on different parts of your book now that you got to the end. It's very, very worthwhile for you to be able to do so, especially if you are wanting to have a conversation about the book with anybody, or especially if you are reading a series like the Hunger Games trilogy. You might want to think back in the first book when you get to the second book even. So this doesn't have to go from just the beginning of one book to the end of one book. It can keep going in a series or in a trilogy. A couple of things to keep in mind. Your second choice board is going to be due after this session today, and then you'll also have an assessment to show what you learned so far in the unit.